Joining me now, former U.S. Ambassador to NATO and President of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, Ivo Daalder. Also CNN's Clarissa Ward and CNN military analyst Colonel Cedric Leighton. Clarissa, let me start with you. Over the last 300 days, we've seen the former British Prime Minister, we've seen the leaders of Italy and Germany and France all travel to Kyiv. But the first trip that President Zelenskyy makes outside of his country, he comes to the United States and thanks the president for leading the rest of the world. The significance of this trip and making Washington the first visit.
The significance of leaving Ukraine in and of itself is huge, Victor. This is a bold move. President Zelenskyy, someone who likes to make bold moves. Just yesterday, he was on the frontline city in eastern Ukraine of Bakhmut. Today, he has left the country for the first time since the invasion to go to Washington. And as you say, it's no accident that this was his first choice in terms of the country that he wanted to visit. It is incredibly important for him to underscore, as you heard in his brief remarks with the president, his gratitude and the appreciation of the Ukrainian people, but also it's critical to really shore up and rally support for the future, because President Zelenskyy understands that while Ukraine has made formidable and really unexpected triumphs on the battlefield, there are still many challenges ahead. It is a freezing cold winter in Ukraine. Russia is bombarding the critical civilian infrastructure there. There are many parts of the country where brutal fighting continues, where a sort of war of attrition or a grinding stalemate prevails. And Zelenskyy knows that he is going to have to push hard to get even more weapons and even more support if he wants to be able to kind of push this over the edge, so to speak. And he also knows that's going to be a challenge, that there are changes happening next month in Congress. And so that's why he's there, to deliver that message, not just to President Biden, not just to the House and the Senate, but also, I think, to the American people, to make that appeal on a personal level. And in doing so, by the way, he is also sending a very bold message to the West in terms of, look, we are united, we are staying the course here, and also to President Putin, who just earlier this week left the country to visit Belarus. And what a stark contrast that is, Victor, to see President Putin sitting there in freezing cold Minsk with Alexander Lukashenko, who's widely called, Europe's last dictator. And today you have Zelenskyy making this bold journey, visiting President Biden at the White House, and really a moment that does feel historic, Victor.
Colonel Leighton, as we've reported here, and the president said this Patriot missile system will be headed to Ukraine. It will take a lot to train the Ukrainians to use it. Is this about the attacks on the infrastructure as we go into the winter, or is this about something broader than that?
Well, it's definitely broader than that, Victor. And yes, it is about the infrastructure attacks. However, it also shows that the Ukrainians are going to be getting a capability that is far more extensive than what they had when it comes to high altitude targets. This means that they can go after aircraft that they haven't been able to go after before, that are flying at higher altitudes, and also cruise missiles. Those are two of the major components that become part of what we would call an integrated air defense system. And that's what we're actually building. What the U.S. and NATO is helping to build in Ukraine is that kind of an air defense system, which will then give them a much better ability to shoot down cruise missiles, drones, and, of course, aircraft.
The U.S. resisted this for months. Should they have handed this over or given this support before now?
In retrospect, you have to say yes, but of course we don't really know, how we didn't know at the time how good the Ukrainians would be at fighting this, and you don't want to throw something into the mix when it's going to be lost. But the Ukrainians have certainly proven that they can not only win, but they can hold on to the things that we give them.
Mr. Ambassador, we saw President Biden and President Zelenskyy together in the Oval Office just a few minutes ago. They will be back at 4:30 Eastern to take questions from the press. Take us inside the rooms and the conversations that are happening now. What are they discussing? What does each side want to know from the other?
Well, they're going to be discussing the course of the war. This is the first time that both presidents are meeting in person since the war has started. They, of course, talked a lot on the phone and on VTC, video conferencing equipment, but this is different. And they really want to take the measure of each other in some sense. The degree to which the president Biden is committed to continuing to support, and the extent of that support that he personally, through Congress and the American people, will deliver to Zelenskyy. And the president will want to know what are in some ways Zelenskyy's goals here. What are we trying to do, and can we make sure that we are aligned in not only today and yesterday, which we have so far, but also tomorrow. Clearly, the Zelenskyy wants to do whatever he can to liberate his own territory, not only the territory that has been taken since the war started on February 24th, but in the 8 years prior to that, when Russia first invaded Ukraine. And the President Biden will want to see whether President Zelenskyy understands that there is a limit to what the United States can do, because we cannot be moved into this war directly militarily, that there's some limit to what we can do in terms of the support we're giving. And that ultimately we also want to find a way for Ukraine to succeed without necessarily leading to an escalation to the use of nuclear weapons on Russia. So this is kind of the conversation that we are having on shows like this, that we're having within the administration. That conversation is now taking place between the two presidents in the Oval.
You know, the picture, Clarissa, we just had up of the two presidents there, President Biden dressed in coat and tie, and President Zelenskyy there dressed like a military leader, the way we've seen him over the last 300 days of this war. He mentioned he was in Bakhmut yesterday and brought that cross for military merit to the president. What does it mean to the Ukrainian people to see their president here in Washington with President Biden?
I think actually it genuinely means quite a lot, Victor, both in the sense that Ukrainians are very keen to ensure that Americans understand how deeply grateful they are for all the support that they have had, and for the leadership of the U.S., because while this is a broader coalition of countries that are helping Ukraine and have really allowed them to have so many successes, there's no question that in the view of most Ukrainians, it is President Biden's leadership that has really kind of facilitated that support. They also want, I think, to convey not just gratitude, but kind of a plea. Please don't forget about us. We understand that you have a lot of your own domestic, political, and economic issues that you're focused and fixated and understandably distracted by. But really, the Ukrainians want to ensure that they don't get forgotten, because they understand that President Putin here is playing the long game, essentially, Victor. He is hoping that Russia can show that it has a higher pain threshold than the West does, that it is willing to suffer more for longer than Ukraine's supporters will be. And so I thought it was very interesting that on the day that President Zelenskyy goes to visit the White House, we also heard from President Putin and his defense minister making all sorts of declarations about how much more they're going to spend on the military, how they're going to beef up the size of the forces, how they're going to work on more hypersonic and intercontinental ballistic missiles, things of this nature, really underscoring that they are in this for the long haul. And so Ukrainians want to make sure that their president does whatever he can to persuade America's leadership and also the American people that they really need to be in it in terms of their support for Ukraine as well. That, of course, remains an open question. And as you heard just now from the ambassador, real questions about how does this end? To what extent does the U.S. go? There will definitely be some tough conversations had behind closed doors, even if in front of the cameras you will see a lot of displays of solidarity, unity, and partnership going forward.
And we'll see that solidarity, unity, and partnership, I assume, in the next hour when President Biden and President Zelenskyy take questions from the media. Clarissa Ward, Colonel Layton, Ambassador Daalder, thank you.